Hello, and thank you for tuning in to this week's episode of Bite-Sized Cybercrime, the podcast where we discuss cybercrimes and cybersecurity news. This week, we're going to be discussing a case that isn't necessarily in the news currently, but has made a bit of a resurgence on YouTube. I watch a lot of long-form content on YouTube, and I've heard my share of sponsors, mostly for VPNs, but that's not what I'm here to talk about, although, if you'd like to hear my opinion on those, I've released an article on my LinkedIn titled, Why You Probably Don't Need a VPN. LinkedIn is where I occasionally publish other security or tech content that I can't fit into my podcast, so if you like my podcast, you might also enjoy those. Anyways, one sponsorship that I see that is very commonly criticized in the comment section anytime someone does an ad read for them is known as BetterHelp. BetterHelp is a company that provides online counseling and therapy services, and from 2020 onwards, it was actually the top purchaser of advertisements on podcasts and one of the most prominent sponsors on YouTube. It makes perfect sense that it began booming after COVID. People's mental health, including my own, were in a rapid decline, and seeing a therapist became pretty difficult due to restrictions. Many traditional doctor's offices and therapists were already doing the switch to telehealth, and BetterHelp was already ahead of the game in that regard. There's nothing wrong with telehealth itself. I personally see my own therapist virtually because it works better with my busy schedule. And frankly, for the purposes of this episode, we're not going to discuss their business model or any alleged issues with the staff. What was wrong with BetterHelp from a cybersecurity perspective was their data sharing practices, and that's what we need to talk about today. One thing I find very interesting and also rather concerning about BetterHelp and other similar mental health apps is that you may assume they are subject to HIPAA, the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, which has the benefit of allowing you to access your own medical records and for them to be easily transferred if you see a new physician, but it's most well known for protecting that data from unauthorized parties. I am pretty familiar with HIPAA, and in the traditional medical field, it is taken very, very seriously. Anyone who looks at medical records of someone they do not provide care for is at risk of hefty fines and immediate terminations. And this also goes for sharing identifying medical information with unauthorized parties without directly sharing those records. You may think that because online counseling apps are providing mental health care, which falls under healthcare, that they're subject to HIPAA, but really these services and apps exist in a strange gray area where HIPAA doesn't always apply. Unfortunately, just because the data is related to your health doesn't mean it's automatically protected. HIPAA only applies to what are known as covered entities. This includes insurance companies and, of course, healthcare providers. Covered entities must sign an agreement that restricts them from doing anything with your data other than help you or help your provider run their business, unless you give them explicit permission. If the app has no connection to a covered entity, the data you enter into it upon your sign-up is not protected by HIPAA. BetterHelp focuses pretty much exclusively on setting you up with a therapist rather than acting as your actual healthcare provider, so the regulations they have to follow may not be as strict as you'd think. Anything you discuss in your sessions with your BetterHelp therapist is protected, but anything else you enter into the app is probably not. BetterHelp started receiving a lot of criticism when in 2022 Consumer Reports saw that they were sending data to Facebook, now known as Meta. Typically sensitive data like your medical information can't be used in targeted ways, but mental health apps simply aren't treated the same way. The president of BetterHelp claims that this data was used on an aggregated basis, not an individual one, which means that your data can't specifically be picked out from the pack. It's not identifying, it's just the data of all the users of the app. But still, this occurring did not exactly make people feel at ease. BetterHelp claimed that they did not use data for purposes other than the ones listed in their privacy policies, but in 2023, the FTC would have to disagree with them. In a complaint, the FTC claims that BetterHelp continually broke privacy policies and monetized consumers' health information to target them and others with advertisements for the service. The data being sent to Facebook that Consumer Reports noted was actually the email addresses of their users, and the fact that they had been seeing a therapist, which was then used by Facebook to find similar users and curate BetterHelp ads to them, or retarget people who had since stopped using BetterHelp. Pinterest and Snapchat also received this data and were permitted to use it for research and product development, and of course for advertising. BetterHelp never stated in their privacy policy that any data would be sold for the purpose of advertising, which is where this issue comes in. And the full report is rather long, I've linked it in my sources below, but the FTC claims that BetterHelp users were continuously misled into believing that their data would never be sold or used outside of BetterHelp's application, and that emails, IP addresses, and health status and history were all collected for the purposes not listed in their privacy policy. This data was, of course, shared with third parties without full consent of BetterHelp customers. BetterHelp settled with the FTC for $7.8 million, which is being returned to users whose data was exposed. 800,000 people will be receiving around $10 each. BetterHelp will also be banned from sharing data with third parties for advertising, and going forward, BetterHelp and possibly similar mental health apps will be more limited in the ways they're allowed to share customer data at all. BetterHelp will also be required to obtain explicit permission to disclose any data to third parties for any purpose, and will now have to limit how long they hold onto this data after a customer has left. Previously, even if you stopped using their services, BetterHelp would still hold on to your data. I've never ended up using BetterHelp, but I did actually take a survey to see if I was a good match for it before it became super popular, and ultimately I was not paired with a therapist. I think that was kind of a blessing in disguise. This is not the most egregious case of a data breach, especially not within healthcare, but it does bring up a lot of privacy concerns in this weird medical gray area, and within an even broader area of data being sold to brokers by just about every website or application that you sign up for. It's something that we know happens, but we kind of brush to the side in favor of convenience. BetterHelp has gotten a lot of attention, mostly because of the sensitive nature of its data and how well known it is, across YouTube especially. So I hope this sparks a wider conversation about data privacy as a whole. Thank you to FTC.gov for providing the press release and BetterHelp complaint that I could read through. It was quite long, but very informative. Thank you to Consumer Reports for initially uncovering the data transfers to Facebook from BetterHelp, and to AP News, The Verge, and Bleeping Computer for reporting on this incident. And of course, thank you for tuning into this week's episode of Bite-Sized Cybercrime. My name is Chloe Tonis, and until next time, stay secure.